Hi everyone. This is going to be an introduction to Zbrush tutorial. Zbrush can be an intimidating program to learn because it has so many menus and different features. There's a bit of a steep learning curve and it can be discouraging for someone new who wants to get into it. I wanted to make something short that someone with no experience could watch and then immediately jump into sculpting. So hopefully within the next 20 minutes or so, you will be on your way to sculpting your first project in Zbrush. I'm only going to go over the bare bones of what I think you will need to start. There's obviously a lot more that goes into learning and mastering ZBrush. Even after years of using it, there are still new things that I learn all the time. The hardest part is getting started. I think it's important to get some of the core concepts under your belt, and then once you feel comfortable with the basics, you can dive into other aspects of the program as opposed to trying to learn it all at once. So let's get started. When you load up ZBrush, there should be a pop-up window with some of the latest Pixelogic news. You can just close that for now. If you click on the little gear icon, you can choose to not have this pop up every time you launch the program. That's why it's not open up on my screen. Behind that, you should see this tab open at the top called the Lightbox. There are loads of resources available in the Lightbox, including project templates. We're going to use a sphere to start with. There are three different options available to use a Dynamesh sphere: 32, 64, and 128. These are all pretty much the same. The numbers represent the starting polygon density. It's not super important which one you choose because we can always change the Dynamesh resolution later on. More on Dynamesh later. Double click on the Dynamesh Sphere 64. Now that you have your project loaded up, we need to go over navigation. There are three ways to move the camera around in the 3D space. You can rotate by left-clicking outside of your model. You can pan by holding Alt and right-clicking. And you can zoom in and out by holding Alt, right-clicking, and then letting go of Alt. You can also snap to one of the orthographic views by hitting Shift while moving around. It will snap your camera to whatever view you are closest to. If your model is taking up the whole screen, you can still rotate by clicking outside of the white bounding box. Likewise, if your model is lost somewhere off screen and you can't drag it back into view, you can hit F to frame. Most of the navigation tools are also available on the right sidebar. It's a little tricky to get the hang of, but after a bit of practice it will become second nature. To start sculpting, you left-click on your model. By default, symmetry is turned on. You can see on the right the larger circle is my cursor, and the dot on the left is mirroring whatever stroke I make. You can turn off symmetry by hitting X, or by going up to the Transform menu and clicking Activate Symmetry. The standard brush is on by default. You can access all the different brushes here in the brush palette. I know there are many to choose from, but most artists only use a handful of them. Other brushes can be useful in specific circumstances. I'll go over some of the more common brushes in a bit. Each brush can be modified in a variety of ways as well. If you look at the top bar, there are three important sliders: size, focal shift, and intensity. You can also access these by right-clicking. Size controls the size of your brush. Intensity controls how strong the stroke you make is on your model. And focal shift controls the drop-off. You can picture within the smaller inner circle, the brush is 100% effective. And then its strength fades outward, ending at the larger outer circle. You can undo strokes you make by hitting Control Z. And if you look at the top, there's an undo cue you can scrub through. Be careful if you scrub through your undo history and then make a stroke, it will delete the history and restart the cue from where you are currently. Besides modifying those sliders, you can also switch between adding and subtracting methods of sculpting. Add is on by default on most brushes. You can click one or the other at the top, but what's easier is leaving one on and then holding Alt to switch between the two. So I can sculpt regularly, which is adding onto my model, and then when I hold Alt, it digs into my model by switching to subtract. Holding Shift will smooth your model. The vast majority of all sculpting in ZBrush relies on these three concepts: adding, subtracting, and smoothing. Rinse and repeat. A process of continual shaping and refining until you're happy with what you have. The standard brush, along with the brush modifiers, will take care of most of your sculpting needs, and I'm sure if you wanted, given enough time, you can make something great with just the standard brush. Let me show you some of the most commonly used brushes that will help you speed up and add variety to your workflow. So the brush I like to generally start out with is the Move brush, located here. And I usually bump up the size, and this is good for just grabbing and pulling your model in different directions and blocking out that base shape that you want to work with. The next brushes I'll go over clay buildup and clay tubes. They work about the same with one key difference. So clay buildup will continuously build up the more you brush over a given area. Clay tubes will only sculpt a single layer, and no matter how many times I go over it, it stays at that initial strength until I release my brush and then click again, and then it'll create a new layer. Dam Standard is great for carving. It's one of the few brushes that has Z subtract on by default. I usually lower the intensity down and then just use it to make a bunch of strokes. Also really useful if you hold down Alt and do Z add for making a ridge. Intensity. Some pretty interesting shapes. H polish is great for flattening surfaces out. There's also flatten and polish and planer. They all do about the same job. And they just give you a nice smooth surface to work with. Good for making planes if you wanted to block out a face or something. You could plane out the forehead. Smooth is on by default when you hit shift, so there's no real need to switch to this brush. And then snake hook is another really useful brush. Works similar to Move where you click and drag out, but you'll notice that it just continuously drags out and the fall off is pretty steep. And this is pretty good for making limbs and appendages. Now, if you look, it runs out of geometry, it runs out of topology. And if I click polyframe here on the right, it'll show you outlines of every single polygon. And you can see that it's kind of, I've spread it too thin. There's not enough topology. So that's where Dynamesh really comes into play here. So I said I use snake hook usually in conjunction with inflate. So Dynamesh will re-blanket your model in even topology at whatever resolution you set. So to access Dynamesh, go to your Geometry tab, down to Dynamesh below Clay Polish. It should be on by default if you selected the right project. And you can use Dynamesh by clicking Control and then drag, and it will re-blanket your mesh in even topology. Then you can go in and use inflate, and it'll balloon out what you've dragged out with the snake hook. And then you can click and control click drag again, and it'll re-Dynamesh. And then you've got topology to work with. So that's pretty much it for the brushes, the most common brushes that I see people using. Some notes on Dynamesh. It's best to start at a lower resolution and work your way up. And you can change the resolution right here where it says 64. That's our base resolution we started with. So if you were sculpting and then you decided that you need a little bit more resolution to work on the next level of detail, you come here and bump this up to, 384. Click and drag. Oop, you didn't make a stroke before. It won't reproject at a higher resolution if you hadn't changed anything on your model. And now it's very dense. You got to be careful because if you raise this too high up, it might crash Zbrush. We turn off polyframe. You can see that it left a lot of the faceting of the lower resolution here. And that's because it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't try to smooth out any of the lower resolution mesh. It just blankets it with polys, and then you have to go in and smooth it out by hand. You also need to be careful. So say you sculpted a bunch of details, you bumped up your topology resolution, and then you sculpted a bunch of details. Where's the damn standard? You wanted to come in and maybe sculpt an eye here. Well, then if I went back down to my 64 resolution, it would wash a lot of that detail out. So that's why it's best, usually, in most circumstances, to start low and move your way up. Another thing to keep in mind, grab the snake hook. If parts of your model are intersecting, let me grab the inflate brush. Like this, and you re-Dynamesh it, it will it'll join them together, and you won't have separate meshes any longer. So most of the time in the earlier stages of modeling, you may want that, but if you wanted to keep two pieces separate and they were too close or they were touching and you re-Dynameshed, it would join your mesh together. All right, I think that's pretty much it for Dynamesh and all the brushes. So when you want to save your model, you can hit Control S, or you can go up to File and hit Save As. Now, there is one little tricky thing here because there's another Save and Save As under Document. You usually don't want to do this. This is going to save the document. It considers the saving an image of your canvas, and it won't save your entire project. So if you want to save your project, Control S or go up to File and hit Save As. Go to the whatever directory you want and name it whatever you'd like, and then you can open it up later and continue working on it. And I think that's pretty much it for this video. I'll have a bunch of extra resources in the description below, and best of luck with your sculpting. Thanks.